Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College.
Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. This is Dr. Crystal Downing, and I'm joined by my co-director at the Wade Center, Dr. David Downing, and our producer, Aaron Hill. And we have the honor of interviewing today one of the most internationally famous Christian authors that the 21st century has seen, and that is Philip Yancey. His books have garnered 13 gold medallion awards from Christian publishers and booksellers. He has more than 17 million books in print, published in over 50 languages. Many of his works explore central issues of the Christian faith, such as award-winning titles, The Jesus I Never Knew, which David has read, What's So Amazing About Grace, which I have read, and Prayer, Does It Make Any Difference? We will be eventually talking to Philip about his brand new book called Undone, but first we want to show how Wade authors have been important to him. And what's exciting for me is the fact that in my upcoming book, The Wages of Cinema, I quote Yancey in an article he wrote about the importance of Dorothy Sayers on his thought. So Philip,
If only he were here today to talk to us about. Oh, there he is. You're right there. Thank you.
Yes. Correct me on this, but I'm reaching way back in time, and I think I first encountered her with a little line from C.S. Lewis, who said of her book, The Mind of the Maker, it's an indispensable book.
Yes.
Is that the right word?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So I thought, well, if it's indispensable to C.S. Lewis, it's indispensable to me too. And I had not read any of her detective stories, the murder mysteries. So she was new to me, and I encountered her first as a theological writer, not a fiction writer or a playwright. A couple of things in that book resonated deeply with me as a writer, and I don't think I got these words quite right in my memory, but she talked about the Trinity of creativity, and I'll use the words that I took away from it. That we have an idea. We have something. As a writer, I have something I want to say. So I've got an idea. I want to write a book about prayer. All right. So then I have an expression. I have to choose what kind of style to use. Who am I directing this book to? As a magazine journalist, I would write for teenagers, and then I'd write for Christianity Today. And the expression I chose was one that would most communicate to a teenager, not to someone who's reader of Christianity Today, and vice versa. So we got the idea, this is what I want to write, the expression, how do I want to say it? And then the communication is not really complete until you have a recognition in the reader, so that they read it and say, well, that's true. That I need to know that. It's going to change my life. So that trinity of creativity, and again, I'm not sure those are exactly the words that Dorothy Sayers used, but that was very helpful to me because, of course, it expresses the real Trinity. It expresses God, the essence of all that is, who chooses to communicate to us in the most powerful and identifiable way. And that was the incarnation. He became one of us.
yes,
That's the story of Jesus. And yet the communication is not complete without that third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is the one who works within us, who expresses our own feelings with groans that words cannot express, as Paul said. That was very helpful. And then there was one other line that I use all the time in speaking that came from that book, I believe. And she said, life is not a problem to be solved, but a work to be made. And I started by writing about pain. My first book was Where is God When It Hurts?
Mm.
And I've been dealing with that topic all of my life, all of my writing career for sure. And our natural instinct, intuitively, when a problem occurs, we want it to go away.
yes,
And so there are people who will promise you on television or the radio that if you just pray, all those problems will go away. I haven't found that to be true.
right,
But I have found to be true, deeply true, the second part of that statement, that God will work with us. I think that's Paul's point in Romans 8, when he talks about all the problems that he encountered, which included shipwreck and snakebite and beatings, imprisonment, things like that. He had a very eventful life. Those problems did not go away, but the work was made in Paul. He said that in all of those things, in every one of them, God worked with him for the good of the Apostle Paul. And that's a promise that we have. And that's, I think, the paradigm of how God works in the world. My goodness, look at the worst thing that happened in human history, the murder of God's own son. It's a day that we now call Good Friday.
Yes.
Because God redeemed that. That's the promise we have. That bad things will happen. As C.S. Lewis said, the world it's a good world, but it's a world that's been spoiled. It's been bent. And God could work within that bending and out of something bad create something good. And that's a promise that we can hold out. And I believe deeply myself.
Lewis actually entertained the idea that there were two falls. The first, Satan rebelled, which led to a lot of what's wrong with our creation, which groans. But then humans joined the wrong side. So he has an interesting theory that it was kind of a cosmic fall followed by a human fall. I think it's only speculation, but it's interesting to think about.
Well, of course, he was well schooled in Milton's Paradise Lost. So,
Right.
That was you could apply two falls to that work as well.
Yes, that's right.
Since we're on Lewis, can you mention we have 7 Wade authors, and for us to even publish this interview, we need to cover all 7.
No,
of course.
No. I'm sorry, that's wrong. But we collect Lewis, Tolkien, Charles Williams, Owen Barfield, and then Dorothy Sayers, G.K. Chesterton, and George MacDonald. I notice in your books, I notice in The Jesus I Never Knew and What's So Amazing About Grace, there tends to be a fairly regular reference to Lewis, sometimes George MacDonald. I think there's a few Chestertons. Do you feel that this group of authors, which we honor at the Wade Center, has been an important part of your spiritual formation?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I've written introductions to G.K. Chesterton's orthodoxy, and I wrote about him in my own book called Soul Survivor. He was asked one time if he was stranded in shipwreck on a desert island somewhere and could only have one book other than the Bible, what would he like? And he immediately replied in true Chestertonian fashion, "Oh, Jane's Practical Guide to Shipbuilding, of course."
That's good. Yeah, that's good.
And when I said that in the introduction to one of his book Orthodoxy, I said, if I could only have one book with me, it might well be Chesterton's Orthodoxy. It was very pivotal in my conversion, really, which was, conversions tend to take a long time, and mine took a very long time. But it was pivotal because it wasn't that rational, logical, step-by-step apologetic. It was more a romantic apologetic.
Yes.
And I had not encountered that before. I read a lot of the logic, but I hadn't felt it in the way he presented it. The other ones, of course, I read Lord of the Rings and other books by Tolkien. I love Charles Williams. He Came Down from Heaven. George MacDonald, I haven't read so much, maybe a couple of the fantasy types, but his sermons, you had a person at Wheaton College there, I think, Roland Hine, who for years would edit his sermons and collect them. And I found those very meaningful to me, just the gracious scope of them, away from you really believed in the love of them. And I was raised with more the fear of God. And so it was very comforting to read truly scripturally grounded material. And then when I read about his life, where he would reach out to, for a period of time there, he was considering co-writing a book with Mark Twain. Anybody who's
an unlikely
Scottish pastor, who could write with Mark Twain, that's a good model for us Christians.
Yes.
Owen Barfield would probably be the least accessible to me. I've tried reading a couple of his things, and they're hard work.
Right.
Oh, I agree.
I think in one of your books you mentioned chronological snobbery, the idea that past generations are all so benighted. And Lewis got that idea from Barfield. So sometimes it's easier to understand Barfield as it's refracted through Lewis's sensibilities.
Yes, that's a good point, right?
Back to MacDonald in The Problem of Pain, there's a whole series of books. You could actually teach a whole course which would include yours. But in The Problem of Pain, Lewis's epigraph is from MacDonald, and it says, Christ died not that we might not suffer, but that our suffering would be like his. Uh, and that's a very evocative but gnomic statement. I'm not quite sure what that means. Have you run across that quotation from MacDonald? Christ died not that we might not suffer, but that our suffering might be like his. That's the epigraph to Problem of Pain.
I don't think I have. That's new to me. I've come up with a saying that's just an observation in my years of thinking about problem of pain. It goes like this: that redeemed pain and pain redeemed impresses me more than pain removed. And it kind of goes
Ah,
back to
Oh, yeah,
the statement by Dorothy Sayers, and I think that may be what George MacDonald was talking about. In my career as a writer, as a journalist, where I've interviewed many people who've gone through hard time, and of course, we're coming off of a pandemic when almost the whole world was
right,
under the shadow. Um, but the ones that impress me most are not, frankly, the ones who have an instant healing, but they're the ones who live with something a long time. And oddly enough, in virtually every survey I've seen on spiritual formation, when people are asked, at what time did you grow most spiritually? It's almost always a hard time. It's a
right,
difficult time. It's a
right,
time when you are really going through the valley of the shadow and you're forced to rely on God, even when God seems absent.
right,
That, of course, that's the most dramatically shown in the book of Job, but it's all through it's all through the Bible to expect that. And Jesus himself from the cross cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That
right.
right,
sense of,
right.
does God care or is God the enemy?
Mm. I find it fascinating learning from you right now that your first book was on pain
Mm,
because your most recent book is also on pain. And
mm,
it is based on the responses to pain by John Donne, an early 17th century writer, a poet that I have been teaching for decades. But you're looking at his essays, and it's one of the John Donne did not publish his poetry, but he did publish his essays. And you have called your book Undone. And why don't we start with that, or maybe start with how you first encountered John Donne and why you thought he was appropriate to retranslate for contemporary culture?
sure. Well, one of the great impediments to faith for many people is this question of if God is good and God is all powerful, why does he allow some of the suffering going on in the world? And at some point, every believing Christian has to deal with that as well, struggle with it. I'm a young person in my 20s, 25, 26 or so, and I read The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis and many other books on pain. And then I came across this little book by John Donne. I think it won the contest for the least attractive title of any
That's
Yeah,
book ever
true.
written.
That's true.
yeah, share it with.
Because it was called Devotions Upon Emergent Occasions.
Yes.
Yes. I'm gonna get a bumper sticker that says emergent occasions happen.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. And yet that book has been in print for 400 years.
Wow.
It's never been out of print. So I picked it up and read it, and there are some very odd things in there because state-of-the-art medicine at that time involved bleedings and cuppings and this weird applying pigeons,
Yeah.
to soles
Leeches.
of your feet. And yeah, just crazy
We're
stuff.
we're in an HMO. We still have a lot of that.
That's good. And yet, when he was wrestling with God, here's one of the great poets all time. And when he was wrestling with God, he did it in a Job-like way because, my goodness, London was going through this incredible pandemic. And eventually, one third of London died. And every night he would hear carts, horse-drawn carts, carrying away the corpses of people who had died during the night. One third of London people forsook the city for the countryside, which they thought was more healthy. So you've got this abandoned city, basically. And there's one giant church there, St. Paul's Cathedral. And John Donne was the vicar, he was the pastor of that church. Then he fell sick and he assumed, and the doctors believed, and told him that it was the plague and that he was likely to die. And so here was this man who had a lot of suffering in his own life, and now he was assigned to comfort this city in crisis, and yet he's believing that he's about to die himself. And it just doesn't make sense.
Mm.
So for 6 weeks or so, he had this illness. He wasn't allowed to consult his Bible. He wasn't allowed to consult other books. He's just lying in bed, sometimes feverish. And he writes this amazing book in that state that has endured for 4 centuries. And when I first read it, I thought, I know why. This is profound. This is wonderful. It's a human being, and Donne had sampled everything in life, who's just dealing with the kind of questions we all have to face at one point or another. And he does it brilliantly and insightfully. So I started giving that book away. I would buy copies of it and give it to my friends. You got to read this book. You got to read this book. And I would go to them later and say, did you read it? Well, I tried. I read a couple pages. That's great. Why didn't you keep going? It's really hard to read. There are several sentences in that book that are more than 200 words long. And then there's all the strange stuff. It was back in the time of King James. So in the same way, it's difficult for some people to read the King James Bible, even more difficult to read John Donne, who is a very witty poet who loved playing with words. You have to work at it.
Right.
And I had the idea of kind of cleaning it up for a modern audience. And I actually did some samples way back in 1976, I think it was, and sent them to a publisher, and they said, well, we just didn't work for us. And my editor at the time, a man named Harold Myra, who became the editor of Christianity Today, said to me, well, why don't you write your own book instead of translating John Donne? So I did. I wrote Where's God When It Hurts? Years later, thank you, John Donne, for that derailment. And then years later, when the pandemic hit, I picked up that project again. What can I say to people who are looking for answers? And here's a man who lived through a pandemic far more severe in some ways than the one we were living through with coronavirus. And one of the great minds, one of the great literary minds in the English language, and also one of the great theologians who was called to pastor during that pandemic. What can I learn from John Donne? And I went back and cleaned that up and took out some of the strange, antiquated science, broke up those 200-word sentences, and just did to John Donne what a lot of people have done to the King James Bible. Anything from the NIV Bible or some of the more literalistic ones to Eugene Peterson's The Message,
Lewis did that in his literary history, the Oxford History of English Language. He had a lot of Latin authors, but then he had these early Renaissance authors. And he thought it wasn't fair to the Renaissance authors to have the Latin in modern English and have their comments in more antiquated English. So he actually went back and did what you did in this book. He went back and took more difficult language and modernized it so the older writers wouldn't be disadvantaged by the ones who were writing in Latin. So without knowing it, you're paying an homage to Lewis in this project.
It's very good. Well, I wasn't aware of that, and I don't know of other examples. I cringe when people talk about modernizing Shakespeare, for example.
Right.
Oh, right. But even Lewis acknowledged the way you just did that Donne's language is problematic. And that Lewis, who just read everything, he described Donne as having twisted strength. So it's like the twisting of his language and metrical audacities. So Lewis was ambivalent about Donne as well. And I think he would be fascinated, since he wrote The Problem of Pain and then, of course, Grief Observed, trying to help people trying to help especially Christians grapple with, why doesn't God answer my prayer? Why am I going through this? In your making Donne more accessible, were there things that made you uncomfortable in his assessment of pain?
Yes. John Donne lived in a pivotal era. A lot was happening in the early 17th century. they were just considering the fact that the Earth may be revolving around the sun
Right.
rather than the reverse. And that was quite controversial. And Donne was himself pretty edgy, and he kind of liked it. He called it the new physics, which is really a new cosmology. And Galileo, Ptolemy, these were people who are still living in many cases, or had just died. And people are still trying to figure out, can we believe that? And what are the ramifications? This was a dramatic moment in understanding our Earth and human beings. The part that made me a little uncomfortable, Crystal, was Calvinism was also new. John Calvin was new. And he, of course, was very strong that everything that happened is ordained by God. Every time a bird falls from a tree, it was ordained by God. I mean, he said that clearly. And Donne grappled with that in the Devotions book because it sounded true. And of course, Calvin could come up with scriptural examples, but it just didn't feel true to Donne. And he would go back and forth. He had a rather randy past. He had been a young Chevalier or something who had been in the army and had probably fathered a child on the European continent and wrote erotic poetry. He got his start writing this rather erotic poetry.
Yes.
And now he's a vicar, and so he's wondering, is God punishing me for that period of time? Am I nailed to my bed? You mentioned that Donne is a person of great wit and kind of double entendre and things like that. And that's one of the things I think that has made this book live, because he preserves that and comes up with these wonderful images of being spread out on the dissection table like a cartographer going over a map. This one image after another like that. And they are vivid and they're accurate, but that I think that hyper Calvinism would be the one thing that made me
interesting. Yeah,
because why would that make me uncomfortable? Because every time either the Pharisees or Jesus' disciples took on that stand, this person is blind because of some sin that he committed. This person is paralyzed, because of something he did.
It sounds Buddhist. This is karma.
It's karma. It is. And Jesus would contradict that every time, and then I think reveal what God wants for us, that we thrive and be healthy and make it possible. Because every time he encountered one of those people, he healed them. So I look at, if you look at the Old Testament, you can definitely see times when God punished people in a painful way, but never without warning that I know of. That's what the prophets are all about. The prophets are saying, unless you repent, these things will happen. And often they'll give 50, 60 years warning of what's going to happen. But in the New Testament, there's much more clarity in Jesus, how he deals with people going through suffering. And he never scolds and calls up that kind of Calvinistic guilt. He rather responds with mercy and with healing.
Right.
So I think John Donne spent a good bit of time in the Old Testament. If you read his sermons, you see that too. And also spent probably a good bit of time just reliving some of the choices he made as a young man that he later regretted.
I think that's almost, I can't remember if it was, I think it was Durkheim who said the natural human tendency is to want to associate good deeds with a good life and a good afterlife. Like we're all trying to make a bargain with God. If I follow all these rules, you will bless me. If I follow these rules, I will get into heaven. He says that's actually kind of the default attitude of humans. And trying to, no matter how much you read the New Testament, people tend to fall back on that. They actually take all of Christ's radical statements about how it's not based upon your good deeds and bad deeds. It's based on grace. And they'll, as you say in your book, what's so amazing about grace? I love the subtitle you didn't use, and why don't Christians show more of it? But yeah, I think that's a very persistent idea. Going back to Job's comforters, people always want to say, well, there's some reason that you're suffering. You must have done something.
Right. And that's what I love about the distinctiveness of Christianity. And we've talked about this on our podcast before, because Sayers thought about this, as did Lewis, that almost all religions operate according to what has been called an economy of exchange. Do this, you get that. Go through this ritual, you will be blessed. it's a good living, works gets you salvation, heaven, 72 virgins, whatever, depending on the religion. Whereas Christianity distinguishes itself from all other religions because salvation is a gift from God, and all you have to do is accept the gift. It is a gift, but that doesn't mean you're not going to suffer. And that goes back to our earlier conversation, how God uses suffering. What are some of the insights you got from Donne about how God employs suffering?
I think, I don't mean to put words in Donne's mouth, but just having spent a lot of time in the devotions themselves, I think he would say something like this, that there are mysteries that we cannot explain. If you look at pain and you try to figure out, okay, why, for example, we're recording this not very long after Tim Keller died. Why would a person like Tim Keller, kind of at the height of his career, with all this wisdom and making global examples of what he was able to accomplish in New York City, why would that happen? Why does a child down the street get leukemia, but not the child in the house next? We can't explain those things.
Mm-hmm.
And the Bible, I'm convinced, does not really give us any insight on that. When God had an opportunity at the end of the book of Job, he just kind of blew it away, saying you couldn't possibly understand. Until you run a universe, don't tell me how to run.
That's good.
Well, even Jesus, when they said, did this person suffer because their sins or their parents' sins? And he says they're suffering so that God might be glorified,
Right.
which is kind of a mystical answer. That's not exactly, it's reframing the whole question.
That God might be glorified. And how is God glorified? Well, in that event, that particular event, because Jesus was there in person, it was through healing. The blind man was healed. And yet, what it strikes me more as a journalist and the people I've interviewed and gotten to know, the ones who somehow mine good out of bad are the ones that impress me most.
Right.
And Donne himself experienced that. There's a famous passage that most of us read in high school back in those days about for whom the bell tolls,
Right.
the bell tolls for thee. And that was a sign of a hinge moment in Donne's experience where he had been very self-absorbed. Pain tends to do that. That's all you can think about. And you feel sorry for yourself and it islands you. And then he realized as he listened to these bells, first he was afraid, oh no, they're announcing my funeral. and then he realized, there are other people in the world than you, John Donne. In fact, there are other people dying in the world than you. And you're so self-obsessed. That may be your neighbor. That may be a member of your church. And have you ever thought about that? And it really was a hinge moment. And he started thinking, well, what can I learn? I can learn compassion, for one thing. And I can learn, as Dr. Paul Brand is a person I co-authored several books with, and he said, a healthy body is not a body that feels no pain. He worked with the disease leprosy, where people who feel no pain actually destroy themselves. He said, a healthy body is not a body that feels no pain, but a body that attends to the pain of the weakest part. And I think that's a lesson that John Donne learned, that one thing we can learn from pain is compassion. And I got to tell you, I this year, 2023, had my own kind of wake-up call on suffering because I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease.
I'm so sorry
to hear that. Yes.
Came out of nowhere, and boy, it's easy to get self-absorbed because I'm looking for changes every day. I have to be concentrating on my 4 times a day medicine. Suffering does that. And that's all you think about. And then I started noticing people around me, people who were fumbling on the overhead bins of an airplane to get their stuff out when everybody's kind of impatient to get off the plane. And I'm thinking that could be me real soon, And it just changes my perspective. I realize how healthy people don't necessarily immediately think of how can I be helpful to the weakest part. And even in our prayer, I pray for the dear people in Ukraine who are being bombed every night. Bombs falling from the air, and the people, Christians, being persecuted in some areas in India, particularly, and some of the African states where there's a confluence of Christians and Muslims together. It just changes things. And I think that's what Donne was getting at. He said, no man is an island. Every time someone dies, every time someone is afflicted, it affects not just them, but all the people around them. And we should be looking for that. We should be attending to the weakest part.
Right. Do you see a structure in Donne's devotions? When I think of some classic works on suffering, like the Book of Job and the Consolation of Philosophy, even Lewis's Grief Observed. The narrator is in a better place at the end of this exercise, this kind of therapeutic writing out of all their feelings and all their anger at God. Do you feel there's an underlying structure to the devotions that we can see him making progress, or is it more being in the slough of despond and you can't seem to find your way out?
One of the things I love about it is that it's feverishly structured, I would say. His fever
Nice
was
word.
coming and going. And one day he would be feeling better, more optimistic. And then the next day he sees some expression on the face of his physician and he goes into panic mode. They're talking in the hallways about me. They're not telling me what's going on here.
Oh, I love that passage where the doctor's trying to comfort him and not act anxious. And he can tell by looking at the doctor's face that it's not good. There's a lot of psychological perceptivity in this work, apart from the spiritual explorations.
Yeah, it is. I guess I would say, you mentioned 2 books by C.S. Lewis, Problem of Pain and Grief Observed. And I'm so glad he did both of those books.
Yes.
Because Problem of Pain is as good a logical address to that lifelong problem as exists. I don't know of a better one. And then A Grief Observed comes along. And when it's your own wife who's in agony from cancer that has spread to her bone, and you're praying and praying, and God seems like he slammed the door and double bolted.
Right.
That's the image Lewis uses. Read both of those books.
Yes.
Right.
In fact, I would say this: read The Problem of Pain when you're healthy. Read A Grief Observed when you're going through it.
Yeah, that's good.
Because the logical exposition doesn't help a lot when you're lying in bed like John Donne with 104-degree temperature, thinking you're going to die.
Lewis's letters were surprisingly cheerful in his last year of life. He says there's more good ahead of us than behind us. And it's interesting to me that he was encouraging other people who were very discouraged about their health. Even, I would say, yes, Grief Observed, but also letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer, and Lewis's own letters later in life. He did have this kind of indomitable spirit, and I think he really knew, even after the bereavement of Grief Observed, I think he knew how to get back towards a right relationship with God and a restful relationship with God.
Yeah, I think you're right. And of course, the movie and the play Shadowlands distorts that.
Right.
It's surprising that Hollywood would do that, isn't it?
Right.
But it makes it look like a huge crisis of faith for him.
Right.
And his faith was never at risk.
Right.
The same with John Donne.
Right.
The faith was never at risk. In fact, because it was never at risk, both of them were able to address God in the way they did. One of the things I love about devotions, much like Augustine's Confessions, the audience, Donne's audience, is God. He's talking in the second person to God. You did this. You did this. and only if you have a trustworthy and deep relationship can you do that. If you're not even sure there is a God, you wouldn't be writing letters to him.
Right.
Yeah, I think Augustine there, he has these wonderful expostulations to God directly. Oh, clean my soul. It needs to be remodeled and rebuilt. But I love that kind of psalmic address to God directly. I think that's a relationship we all should have. As a Christian intellectual, sometimes God becomes too much in the third person. And Lewis liked Martin Buber, I thou. How do you develop an I thou relationship with God rather than an I him?
As you talk about this, Philip, I think of the relevance of my favorite John Donne poem, Batter My Heart. And it goes, batter my heart, three-personed God, for you as yet but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend. And what is powerful about that is the enjambment of the first line. It's batter my heart, three-personed God, for you. And the line ends, for you. So it's this sense that I want to be your follower. I want to be the best disciple possible, but I just need, to put it in modern language, a little kick in the pants to focus more of my attention. As yet you but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend. And it seems to me that these devotions upon emergent occasions, it's like God is battering his heart at that moment. But he recognizes it's for you, God, that this battering needs to happen.
I heard that just last week, Crystal, that poem. It's quoted in the movie Oppenheimer.
It
Oh,
is.
really?
Oh, we
You're
haven't
aware of
seen
that?
it
Yeah.
yet.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, to good effect, I hope.
Actually, that's all he says. Better my heart, three persons God. And you have to kind of
Okay.
Oh, follow up on it.
apply your own
Knowledge,
interpretation to why he said that. But
How about the Barbie movie? Were there any references to Dunn in the Barbie movie?
Now's the time for you to tell us why you call, and I love the title, you call your book Undone. So why did you choose that title?
Well, John Donne was a great punner. He enjoyed puns and double entendres, as I mentioned. His shortest poem went like this. He grew up as a Catholic in a time when Catholics were being persecuted.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, he did take schooling at Cambridge University, but he wasn't allowed to take a degree because he's one of those Catholics. So he had a hard time getting a job. And people say sometimes that he had a conversion of convenience because he went from wanting to be one of these cavaliers in the court of King James to becoming a minister, to studying for the ministry. And nothing in his past had seemed to lead in that direction. But if you read him, of course, it may have been a conversion of convenience, but it was a true conversion that changed the course of his life. When he was young, he married a woman. Her father was not pleased with that. So he actually put John Donne in jail. He had just been married to the daughter of this man, and the man put him in jail, his father-in-law. And John Donne wrote his shortest poem, goes like this: John Donne and Donne undone. Years later, he would begin a sermon by saying, "Lo, I am the man that has seen affliction." And if you read his story, and I tell some of it in the book, you realize he had so many children who were born and either stillbirth or died in childhood. His wife died, and then he was left with this brood of children, and one disappointment in his career after another. In the first 2/3 of his life were just kind of a mess. And then, of course, at the height of his career, when he could have been so helpful, boom, he's hit with this illness. And Undone is kind of what happens to us in an illness like this. I mean, think of the pandemic. Industries were undone. People couldn't come to work.
Yeah.
Schools were undone. Well, then the internet came along and found other ways to get them done.
Yeah.
But people are undone. For the rest of our lives, 20 years from now, we're going to be telling our children what it was like to live through this time when the world stopped, when there were no people on buses or trains, when the airplanes stopped flying, all of this. The world comes undone. And surely our own kind of self-worth comes undone just because everything is upset. So that's what the publisher kind of wittily, in true John Donne's fashion, they took that word undone, and on the cover, I don't know if you've seen the cover, but on the cover there's there's a floating extra in there, because Donne is spelled D-O-N-N-E, John Donne. Right. But it says undone, and then there's an N floating around. So even John Donne was undone.
Right.
I love that. How can people get a copy of this book? When will it be published, and can they reach out to your publisher?
Yes, they can. I have a website at philipyancey.com and a Facebook site. I'm of that era, that age, where I still do Facebook, and we'll have information about it there. But there's a press called Rabbit Room Press.
Right.
Rabbit Room Press, based in Nashville, Tennessee. The book will be out first week of October.
Okay.
And you can pre-order it. And of course, it's available through Amazon. It will be on my page and others. But either the website, philipyancey.com, or Google Rabbit Room Press. And they've got they don't publish many books, but they're very thoughtful and helpful books. There's one that has sold a lot called Every Moment Holy. It's a series of daily prayers, or prayers to use while changing diapers, prayers to use while cutting the grass, but very thoughtful. And there's quite a colony of artists developing in Nashville, Tennessee.
Right.
That's an exciting movement they've got there. It's a lot of young musicians and craftsmen and writers all there in
Right.
the
Yes,
Nashville, Franklin area. They have a conference
right.
called Hutchmooch, keeping with the.
Yeah, I'll be there.
Oh,
Oh, you will
good.
be.
Yeah, David and
I will,
I were
yes.
there several years ago, before the pandemic, of course,
Uh-huh.
and did a performance of Letters Back and Forth between Lewis and Sayers, and
Oh,
the
wow.
people were just raging with laughter. It is very funny because Dorothy Sayers, she lets people know what she thinks. So I am delighted that the Rabbit Room has got into publication. I think, David, do you have any last questions to ask Phil?
Well, I was just visiting your website and discovered your blog or your which is very rich. I like those short meditations, and also your book Grace Notes is now online. So I really admire your work, and I love your endorsements. Do you have trouble staying humble?
Yeah.
The endorsements are Billy Graham loves this book. Or Lewis Speeds, St. Augustine says he's the most important Christian writer since I died. You go, wow, what an endorsement. So, but
The writing itself is a discipline of humility. I'm sure you
Yes.
right,
both know
right,
that. There is nothing that cuts you down to size than staring at that blank computer
right,
screen,
right.
and you've got to produce something by today. It's
Right.
just, why did I ever get into this? I'll never come up with anything worth saying again.
Oh.
Just battle that all the time.
Somebody on Facebook put, take a man's wallet, he's poor for a week. Teach him to be a writer, he's poor for a lifetime. So that's true, I think, of many people who try to take up the writing profession.
Right.
I would just say thank you for the time you're spending with us. Thank you for your boldness in taking, many ways, people want the upbeat topics. They want to talk about heaven and healing and family. And I just really like the clear-eyed, honest way in which you look at suffering, in the way you look at problems in the Christian church. You have really made a major contribution to the intellectual and spiritual life of the Christian community.
Well, thank you. One time I was asked to speak at the University of Virginia on some lecture a couple of years in advance, and they kept saying, we need a topic. We're publishing a brochure here. And so I said, well, I don't know what I want to speak on 2 years from now. They said, well, just come up with something and we'll stick it in the brochure. So I wrote two themes that haunt me. Two themes that haunt me.
Oh,
Well, as I got closer and closer, I realized I got to come up with those two themes.
yeah.
This is just a placeholder, And then as I thought about it, two themes become very clear, and those were suffering and grace. Those are the two things that almost everything I start writing about, I end up writing about in a different version. So you wisely pulled those two together earlier in our conversation, David, when you said suffering is often put against grace, and it's karma, rather than grace, and the two are in opposition. But suffering can also be the one place where, oddly enough, paradoxically, we can experience grace, as John Donne did. I mean, you talk about redeemed pain.
Right.
This book alone, this book alone is a redemption of what he went through. And there's that promise that we have from God that God is a recycler, can take the bad things and somehow work good out of them. And then our job as Christians, if we're not the ones going through suffering and pain, our job is to represent in 2 Corinthians 1 what Paul calls the God of all comfort, the Father of comfort. And I wish we live in a time when it's a divided country, and evangelicals and Christians in general are often seen as a hostile force. I wish we would be seen, as Paul commands us to be seen, as representatives of the God of all comfort and the Father of compassion. That would be my goal. And I hope this book makes one little contribution just to remind people we do have to wrestle with these things, and people are around us, and they need the wisdom of people like John Donne.
Right.
And if I can help make it a little more accessible after 3 centuries of the English language evolving.
We forgot to get in a plug for Wheaton College. Do you feel like you gained the ability to write these books from your time at Wheaton College? Is that where you really went from the caterpillar to the butterfly?
That is where I got my first job. I walked up and down. I was trying to pay my tuition bills and walked up and down Christian organizations that were headquartered in Wheaton and got a job at Campus Life magazine. They thought, if our name is Campus Life, we should have some writer on a campus, right?
Right.
And I was at Campus Life, so that's the first and only job I got. And eventually it morphed into Christianity Today because they acquired CT acquired Campus Life, and then all of my books, all of my archives, first drafts, things like that, are going to go to the Wheaton Archives.
Oh, great!
As well. So I've got 7,000 books here that are all marked up with my notes.
Oh, wow! Wow.
So there they are, and I got a database which goes to Wheaton as well.
Oh,
so
wonderful!
Thank you.
That's where I got my start, and that's where I'll get my end.
Well, I think a good way to end this podcast is with another famous quotation by John Donne, and it seems to me this is the impulse of what we've been talking about as Christians struggling with suffering, and it's his famous sonnet, "Death be not proud." And it ends with that wonderful phrase, "Death, thou shalt die."
And with that quotation, we are done.
All right.
Thank you so
Never
much,
to be
Philip,
undone.
for joining us.
Oh, it's a delight.
Okay.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.